Hi everyone, and welcome to this PAX panel. Today we're going to be discussing gaming in defence contexts. So all the gamers out there, I'm a gamer's wife. My husband Morgan Jaffet runs a game studio and I've been a gamer's wife for over 20 years. But also I work in defence and I'm a philosopher. And I love gaming, I love board gaming, I love role-playing games, I love interactive theatre sports, I love consoles, I love card games, dice. I will do anything pretty much if it's turned into some form of game. Why is that? Why are games so interesting and so significant? And why is it that we go to them in recreation, but that the highest levels of government and governance also utilises gaming and game types in order to try and think through and come up with decisions in some of the most complicated and difficult areas of decision making with the greatest amount of risk to harms and loss of human life relevant to Australia's defence, and indeed war games are used throughout the world. So welcome to our session. Before we begin, I'd like to give an acknowledgement of country. We have some really fantastic panelists today, and we're all speaking from different Indigenous regional tribal lands. So I'd like to give an acknowledgement of country to the Yagara and Turrbal people, who are the First Nations residents of the Brisbane and surrounding areas in which I speak. And Beth Carrier speaks. Give us a wave, Beth. And Helen Marshall speaks also from those lands. We are also joined today by people from the Gadigal of the Eora Nation from Sydney. That's Malcolm Ryan and Macquarie University. And I'm learning some of these national names for the first time, which is great. So I'm learning more about the Indigenous tribes of a broader part of Australia. And then, of course, we have the Ngunnawal tribes that are the original custodians of the lands of Canberra, where we have another panellist, Deane-Peter Baker, who is joining us from Canberra, and I'll try my best to keep us in order also, but also to see what emergent and interesting conversations we could have in this space. Everyone on the panel today has had some intersection with defence thinking and defence problem spaces, as well as has intersected with the idea of how we can bring games to further our understanding of existing and emerging potential situations in defence nationally and internationally. So that's probably enough from me in the first instance. I'll also just give a little pre-blurb as well that's a little bit more focused on the topic. So, you know, the research behind the games of defence, this is what we're going for today. So everyone knows that defence participates and runs a lot of war games and activities to help in training. But did you also know that they use them to influence policies and practices for the future force? And it's not just defence members that help shape this narrative and action the outcomes. This panel aims to talk about the researchers behind these type of war games and what goes into them. The research, preparation, development, implementation and response. How does wargaming help to integrate the new and emerging technologies being adopted within the force and assess the known and unknown risks associated with them? What do games practices lend towards a better understanding of our potential capabilities? So that's what we're looking for today. And so without further ado, I might start with Deane-Peter Baker, who's joining us from University of New South Wales. Dean, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do and what you think?
Sure, thanks very much. And of course, I'm not at ADFA because we're in lockdown at the moment. I'm at home.
Oh, right, correct.
And of course, my laptop failed today, so I'm doing it on my phone. Hopefully, this will all work okay. So yes, I'm also a philosopher by background, but mostly focused on ethics. That's what I do, and I'm a military ethicist in particular. That's my area of interest. So one of the big questions relating to military ethics today is the question of the ethics around lethal autonomous weapons. So in other words, you might have heard of them referred to as killer robots. There is a campaign to ban killer robots, or rather to stop killer robots is the name of the campaign. And there's a big discussion going on in the international arena around what are the rights and wrongs of using or not using these systems? Should they be banned? Should they be controlled and restricted in various kinds of ways? And one of the things in my own engagement with this, I've had the opportunity to engage in some of the debates in Geneva under the UN over this question. And one of the things that became very clear to me was that the debate has been hindered by a lack of realism to some degree. So there's been a lot of discussion about the key underlying normative principles, which is exactly right. Those should be there. But because these are systems that are very, very new, we don't really yet have a good sense of how they will be used likely in future conflicts. And that's, in my view, is a key frame for thinking through what the ethics are of these systems. And that's where the gaming came in for us. So my colleague, I'm not an experienced gamer, but my colleague, Professor David Kilcullen, is a very experienced war gamer. And so we put our heads together and came up with a war game really designed to mimic as best we could. Obviously, we're looking at the future, but a future environment in which these systems, lethal autonomous weapons, were being used in a conflict or a combat situation. And the idea was to use them, but to see how useful they are. And so part of the debate around autonomous weapons, as I say, lacks this realism because we don't know what it is we're weighing up. How important will they be? What potential likelihood will they have to save lives on our side or the lives of non-combatants? Or will they be more likely to be problematic in that regard? Will they be indiscriminate or will they likely be used in disproportionate ways? And so we wanted to play out as realistic as we can. And again, these are systems that don't fully exist yet, but to try to kind of figure out how they would be used. And often we don't realize that technology is very important, but it's about how the technology is used, and that's about the humans behind it. And so we were really able to use this 10-day war game to explore this, and it's been a fantastic tool for us. We haven't got all the results out yet. We've got another round to come, but it's been very, very useful, I think. And so I think it's an example of how games can advance a policy discussion. Should we or should we not have these kinds of systems? So I'll pause there, and I'm sure we'll pick up more in the question discussion.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic way to start, Dean, because I think the lethal autonomous weapon systems debate really is at some of the absolute core of some of the concern of emerging technologies, and a lot of thoughtful people interested in it, but not necessarily making the progress they might have hoped in terms of how these things are governed and managed. I think that would be a great moment to bring Malcolm Ryan in. I think, Malcolm, if you're able to speak, because I think the ethics conversation there is strong with you as well. So if you're able to go, I think that'd be terrific. Thanks, Dean.
Thanks, Kate. Yes, so I am a researcher at Macquarie University. I'm guessing the more traditional gamer on the panel. So my main work is in teaching game design and development. I'm also a published game developer with a couple of mobile games to my name. But my main research area is in looking at this area of ethical decision making in video games. Excuse me. And so I'm particularly interested in how games present us with ethical decisions and how players go about deciding, making those decisions in games. And then ultimately how we can use games to train people to work on their moral sensitivity, on their moral judgment, to be better, more moral people. So in the military context, I think this makes an interesting connection with war games, because one of the issues that I see with war games is, especially when we create games that are kind of abstracted and we're moving pieces around on a map in a strategic war game, it's easy to lose the humanity of the situation and to therefore lose any sort of sense of empathy for what you're doing or the ethics of what's involved. And so I'm very interested in this area of integrating the ethical decision making into the war games, so that we are aware of the ethics of what we're doing when we're playing these games, and that we make our decisions accordingly, taking those ethical decisions into account. So in my research, I'm looking at I'm drawing on moral psychology, which is sort of the psychological understanding of how we make moral decisions. So when we're making an ethical choice, what's going on in our heads, and how do we practice that in order to become better at being moral people? And so that's what I'm doing. And yeah, I'm pursuing a relationship with the Australian Defence Force to talk about the idea of integrating this kind of ethical gameplay into war games in order to make a more, I guess, a more holistic experience of those kinds of games.
Thanks, Malcolm. Yeah, your research is very, very interesting work, and some of the only work I know that is drawing, I think, from the academic moral psychology literature through the lens of gaming structures and processes from that deep gaming understanding. And certainly we're lucky in Australia to have that kind of progressive academic work occurring at the same time that Defence is really motivated and interested in increasing their ability to teach ethics and to inculcate ethical thinking and decision making throughout the ADF. So the timing seems really fortunate there. So that's terrific. And after Malcolm's talk, I think Helen probably will segue to you in the game space. So we've gone through the ethics and maybe more towards the gaming space. I would love to hear from you.
Thanks very much, Kate. I'll just share my screen here, so bear with me for a moment. So my name is Dr. Helen Marshall, and my background is also quite different, I think, from the speakers we've heard from so far, in that I come to gaming from the perspective of creative writing. I am a longtime gamer, like Kate. I love board games, I love role-playing games. I spent most of lockdown developing a Dungeons & Dragons group with my fellow lecturers, and in some ways that fed into the research that I've begun doing around defense. So the particular project that I wanted to talk about was one that emerged as a joint collaboration between myself and my colleague, Professor Kim Wilkins, here at the University of Queensland, where we run something called the What If Lab. And it's interested in using creative ways to help multidisciplinary groups collaborate on complex problems. And for me, game playing is a big part of that. And for this project in particular, we were also working with Cameron Turner from the School of Business around innovation and technological innovation, as well as the Australian Defence Force. So what we were looking at was ways in which we could allow experts in a range of different subjects who often have trouble maybe communicating with one another to share their expertise and think about new technologies and how they might play out. So both Professor Kim Wilkins and I are writers. We work in science fiction and fantasy, and science fiction I think is particularly useful for thinking about how things might develop in the future. We have a whole skill set based around imagining what the future might look like. So we wanted to use the skills that we'd learned as writers and as game players to facilitate this workshop, which was designed primarily for business students to help think about how to problem solve. So the kind of gaming we were using was something called a matrix game, which is a pretty simple game engine. And it might seem sort of familiar to people who have played things like Dungeons and Dragons. It's low tech. Each member in the workshop, or the workshop is divided into small groups, each of whom gets a character that they're controlling within a set scenario. And then everybody takes turns declaring what it is that they're going to do and what they want the outcome to be. Then the group as a whole discusses what the likelihood is that the action is going to succeed. And on the basis of that discussion, everybody can contribute their expertise. So I think what's useful about this kind of game playing is that it allows you to layer in different kinds of expertise. So it's not just about engineers and about defense personnel, but you could also bring in political scientists, you could bring in human geographers, sort of a range of experts who can think about different ways in which events might actually play out. And then you roll a dice to see what happens, with modifications based on what people have said might be likely to occur. So I think what works well about this is that the game is ultimately bound by the expertise in the room. How realistic it is depends on the kinds of expertise that people actively contribute. And what the dice do is they add an element of random chance, which makes it a lot more fun and a lot more engaging, as anybody who's ever rolled a critical success or a critical failure has found before. So what this does is it allows us to model tipping points, reversals, and events that are plausible but unexpected. So what's nice about it is it means that even if you have a good idea, it doesn't mean that things will necessarily play out the way that you want it to just because your idea is good. So we found that these kinds of games can be really effective. So they can improve predictive accuracy because, unsurprisingly, humans are pretty good at guessing and imagining what other humans might do in a given situation. These sorts of games don't require a lot of setup, so it took us, maybe 3 or 4 hours to develop the scenario, and then we played it out over the course of about half a day. And in our case, we were looking at a near future scenario, what technology might exist within the next 18 months or so, and it was modeled loosely on a potential evacuation. And we chose that scenario because we wanted to work with gray zones, so that situations in which civilian and military populations might be difficult to distinguish from one another, and might also have different kinds of impacts on the way that events actually unfolded. So matrix games can be particularly good for this sort of work because they work well at modeling events in which multiple characters or multiple agents might have an impact on events. It's not just 2 sides or 3 sides. It's people who have different ambitions, different goals, and different victory conditions. And most importantly for our purposes, it allows you to harness the wisdom of crowds as experts contribute to the discussion. It gives a bigger picture of the different elements that might be in play. And lastly, I suppose these sorts of games are really fun. They're really engaging. They immerse the players in a shared story. And in our case, the purpose of the game wasn't necessarily to model or predict what would happen, or even to be competitive, so with one side winning over the other. Really, it was to have everybody in the room contribute to a shared sense of the problems that the Australian Defence Forces might be facing, so that a group of MBA students could then go out and try to solve the most pressing of those problems, thinking about technologies that could be deployed to help. So I found so far in my own experience with gaming, particularly within the context of working with defense, is that these sorts of games can be really useful to help people from different fields communicate with one another and develop a shared sense of what the problem is. It can also help them let go of their preconceived notions and listen more intently to one another. And vitally, I think, as a creative writer, it helps them use their imagination. So that's the work that I've been doing.
Thanks so much, Helen. As a happy participant in your Matrix games, I have to say it was really fun as an still a role player, but slightly more ex-role player with all the family and the nonsense. But being involved in what seemed like a large free-form role-playing game with your careful sort of guidance to those who hadn't played that kind of game before, and with these different players. And there's no doubt that what's known as the coin games in the board game industry have had a heavy influence on defense gaming, such as Hegemon, the game that has been published by the RAND Corporation in order to investigate how the future of autonomous technologies actually affect the way people think strategically and act tactically, and what kinds of responses do nations give under these complicated multi-party considerations, either globally or in a specific location. And as you say, this cross-disciplinary access point really enables a lot of stakeholders to those conflicts to speak out, hopefully in a safe environment where they don't feel like they'll be penalized for having a voice. So appreciate your perspective very much. And that leads us to our final panelist, Beth Carrier. So Beth, why don't you tell us a little bit about your perspective on the topic?
Yeah, so the order is good because I have something in common with Helen, and that my background is creative writing, and yet I'm not games. But I am a researcher with trusted autonomous systems because I'm interested in the point at which the rules break down. So I care about the open world in the sense that I came into this work sort of recruited because of September 11. And it's a good place for me to share my screen. So I'm also interested in tipping points, the moment where the world changes beyond what you could expect it to do. And something that narrative gives us is new causal paths. I really liked something that Dean mentioned earlier about we don't know what the situation can actually be until it happens, until we imagine it. And so part of my role is to imagine unpredictable futures. It's also, now I began with the gaming community because I was interested in how you kind of formalize some of those structures. One of the reasons why we tend to be worried about computers making their own decisions in an unpredictable world is because they follow structures a little bit like this. They're logical, you code them in advance, and the way that they're structured, usually you have to anticipate what's going to happen, all of the things that are going to happen for them to be able to act on it. So I was brought in to contribute my knowledge of how stories work and how they can take us from one situation to another that we might not have predicted. I draw these rather complex diagrams to understand how it's not, sometimes it's not just a case of going, you know, if this, then this. Many contexts can bear on an outcome, and they're very difficult to model when you have the endless world to draw from. So I'm going to interact more with a panel in a second, but I thought people might get a kick out of seeing when you're trying to develop ways to represent structures that aren't commonly represented, you have to develop whole new platforms and tools. So this is an immersive environment, for example. And at the moment, I'm still working towards the one that's easiest to use and easiest to read, simply because there's nothing currently that easily allows you to represent many situations interacting with each other and changing simultaneously. So I'll pop out of there. So along those lines, one of the things I like to do, so if we bring up the anxiety about killer robots, there are a couple of things that I'd like to do to kind of change the space a little bit. The first is, what if we imagine some things a bit outside the box? For example, nanotechnology that could go through your body and identify problems or anticipate, like tell you about things that may, illnesses that may befall you in the future, or alert you to what it seems to be very minor deficiencies in your vitamin count or fluctuations in, your, iron or something like that, that you could eventually become more problematic in the future. And the other thing so it's not just the Terminator is sort of what I want to say about that. And the other thing is, in terms of defense, when countries develop the capability to have an autonomous system fight a war, these wars are going to occur at speeds that humans cannot keep up with. We will need the capability to meet like with like in some sense. So we're also entering a world in which we're going to have to depend on machines a lot more just to sort of stay ahead of the game. And part of what I'm interested in doing at TAS is both working out how to make the distance between humans and machines closer so we can trust what they're doing and we can communicate with them so that they can appropriately enact on what we want. And so that sort of the best skills of humans and computers can be brought together.
All right. Well, thank you so much to the panel. I'm really delighted to listen to all of your contributions. And I think we've got some time now to sort of explore or unpack a little bit of your research in detail. So I'd like to start the ball rolling by putting us in the position of defence. So the Australian government say that they want to invest in some new games. They're going to put out a bid for some new games. By the way, this is a hypothetical. Everybody out there in the audience, we don't yet have the money, but let's suppose the money is there. They know that games are important. They're really willing to invest in high quality video game or other game experiences, particularly to train up defence personnel. to make better decisions in a future conflict. So that's the brief. That's what they want to do. And so, of course, you've heard about this money, which, of course, is so much money, exactly the kind of money you need as a researcher to fund exactly the thing you want. And so you have no problems getting the resourcing together once that money is available to you. To the panel, what games are missing from the current market in games to model and allow the player to experience the future of war? So what kind of game does defense need that we don't currently have access to? And tell me a little bit about it from the perspective of play. So what are the play mechanisms, the actual gameplay itself? What kind of actions do the players take and reactions they experience? And what content is in the game? So what kind of content areas do defense personnel need to know more about as they go about these action cycles? So who would like to tell me how they would spend defense's money on a game?
I can go.
Malcolm.
Very happy to spend defense's money.
What do we need?
Look, so I think it's not going to be a wholly different game from the one, well, it's not going to be a wholly different game from the ones that are out there, but it's going to integrate different kinds of gameplay into one experience is what I'm most interested in, at least. Let me unpack that a bit. So we've got our war games, right, which are generally either, well, we can do them on different levels. We can think of sort of the strategic level war game, which is more about moving units around a map, or we can think about our actual, tactical first-person shooter style of war game where you're actually running in with the guns kind of experience. From my perspective, what both of those are sort of systems-driven games. The tactical game is driven sort of by the resource economy of moving units around and providing them with what they need and all of those sorts of things in order to win the battle. And so that's the system that you're playing with when you're doing that. And in the sort of tactical thing, the system you're playing with is the movement through space and the interaction through shooting and that sort of thing as well. The thing that we lack there, so then from the ethical point of view, from the interest of what I'm interested in, it's very hard for the game then to know about the ethics of that situation or know about what's going on there. And so you see these, if you look at any kind of games that on the commercial market which are doing kind of ethical decision making, they're generally scripted storytelling games like The Walking Dead or any of those kind of games that have a clear narrative arc to them, and the choices have all been written for you, and the choices are very clearly scripted as a moral choice between do X or do Y, and what is the good thing to do. And it's very easy to introduce the ethics when you've got that control as a designer. You say there are two choices, there is, this has this moral effect and this has this moral effect. It's much harder to introduce the ethics when you've got a rich system that you're playing with of moving armies around on a map, and you've got to say there's a lot more possibilities in that space, and it's a lot harder for the game as a computer game to talk to you about that, to actually sort of communicate back to you some of the ethics of what you're doing, because the computer isn't smart enough to realize that this layout of armies on the map is more ethically problematic than that layout of armies on the map. Whereas if we scripted that as a written choice, we could easily control that. The problem with the scripted ones is they don't have that level of flexibility, that we can't make all of these sort of rich space of decisions that you could in a strategic game. And so somehow we've got to marry these two genres of games, the either more strategic or more tactical systemic game and the more scripted sort of storytelling game. And that's where I think the kind of work that Helen's doing is interesting, because when you take that off the computer and just do it in person, you have the capability of doing that. You have the capability to have a conversation around the system you're playing. And so you can play you can play the armies on the map, and also have a conversation between the people about, well, wait a second, is this the ethical thing for us to be doing, or where is that happening? My concern with the pure systemic games is that they is this problem of dehumanization, or this problem of once we introduce games into the military, and well, I mean, they're obviously there already. If we're training people to regard for their own forces and enemy forces as just pawns on a map that we're moving around, then we're losing the humanity of our own troops, and we're losing the humanity of our opponents and the other people involved in the situation. And so to bring the ethics into that, we need to have some integration with this kind of storytelling element that the others are talking about, where we can say, yeah, there's sort of a more meaningful story happening here of people's lives that we're interacting with, rather than just units that we're pushing around on a map, or NPCs that we're shooting in a shooter. And so that's, for me, where I see the critical research problem is. And I would love Defence to give me a lot of money to research that problem. At the moment, I don't see that connection working very well, and I see there's an ethical risk in using games without that element to them. The problem, on the other hand, of using the scripted games is that they're very much ethics games, and going into that this is an ethics game, and so I turn on my ethics thinking, my ethics brain when I start playing those games, and I make those choices, and that's fine. But then when you're dealing more with just moving units around the map, you still need to turn on your ethics brain. And without that prompting to say, this is an ethical choice, what are you going to do? You need to be able to say, oh, that arrangement of units on the map is an ethical problem, and I recognize that in that situation. And so that's where I think the research needs to be done in sort of designing more games of this kind of thing, finding ways of making these elements meet one another, and it's about bringing together the systems and the storytelling. So yeah, that's, for me, that's how I would spend Defence's money. So we're willing to give me.
No, that's good. Can I ask a couple of clarificatory questions, Malcolm?
Sure.
So in your mind, suppose you make that game.
Yep.
What's your value proposition to Defence? That's a bit business terms, sorry. But what do you tell them in terms of how is it going to help their people? What do you think? What actual effect do you think it might have if you built the game you wanted on Defence personnel?
Right. So the problem, as I see it, is, I think mostly about ethics education. And the problem I see with ethics education is that we have this, it's very easy when we're in the ethics classroom to be thinking about ethics. And we can be very good moral people, able to, when presented with a moral problem, dissect it meaningfully and work out all the different elements that are at play, and make a strong moral argument for one action or another. But then we step out of the ethics classroom and we forget. And it's not that we stop being moral people, it's that we just don't remember to turn on our moral focus. So in moral psychology, they talk about 4 main components to moral thinking, which are moral focus, moral sensitivity, moral judgment, and moral action. And moral focus is your ability to just look at a problem and say, there are moral things here, I need to think about this morally. Moral sensitivity is then your ability to weigh up the different aspects of the problem and see where the moral concerns arise. Moral judgment is then making the decision, and then moral action is putting that decision into effect. And moral focus is one of the big problems, because the research shows that we can be quite strong at our moral judgment and our moral sensitivity, but when we're not presented with something as saying this is a moral problem, sometimes we just have what's called moral blindness. We just don't see it. We're in the middle of something we see as a pragmatic, strategical problem, and we're focused on the outcomes and on achieving whatever our goal is, and our brain doesn't. The little moral part of our brain is just sitting, saying la 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 to itself, and not actually inputting into that decision. And so one of the key skills we need to develop is the ability for that moral part of our brain to say, wait a minute, you need to think about this. And people can be, some of the best moral philosophers in the world and still have this problem that that part of their brain won't turn on at the right times. And so what I want to achieve out of designing these games is to well, first of all, explore that conflict, but eventually build training tools where we're able to train people to bring that moral thinking to bear. They might be in the midst of a big, deep tactical problem, and then that moral part of their brain will be trained to go, wait a second, what about? And that's the value proposition. It's the ability to say we don't lose ourselves in the pragmatic concerns of a situation and forget our morality. And so I want to develop games that are able to, rather than dehumanize the elements of the game, games that keep prompting you to say, what about ethics? What about ethics? And so that you can keep coming back to that question. So yeah, that's what I believe that we can do. Whether we can do that, I mean, this is research. This is why, if I knew the answer, I wouldn't be a researcher. I wouldn't, this is something I'm not 100% confident we can do. And if we can't do it, we need to strongly think about how we're using games in our processes. Because if the games are teaching us to turn off our morality, then that's definitely a problem. And I believe we can do it, but I don't believe we have all the answers yet. And so I think this is why I would love to spend Defence's money to research the answer to this problem.
Thanks so much, Malcolm. All right, who else in the panelists have got a game? Beth, yep.
I'm writing a proposal with you as I'm sitting here, Malcolm. So I'm all about multiple contexts. So, and the idea that you might, it's hard to have moral focus, like, if you're not in the context of contemplation, especially if somebody is shooting at you. But this is precisely what we ask our military people to do. So I'm imagining an immersive multiplayer game, probably in Unreal or Improbable, that has many players with agency as well as computer simulation, where you've got multiple problems happening at multiple scales, and that the effect of any of those things can impact on other people. So the issue of scale connects with what you're saying, I think, because say you connected one of those awesome paramedics simulations that exist to a sort of a big military simulation. And so for 1 minute, you're just trying not to be shot or not to be bombed. And then the next thing, you've got somebody who's exhibiting all the signs of cardiac arrest right next to you. So that kind of multi-layer decision-making, I think that would better prepare people. There's a PTSD element in there too. Like if you are introduced to life-threatening situations in an environment where it won't actually kill you and where there is maybe some moderation or control, perhaps it could act as a form of inoculation. Or help a little bit later down the track if you actually encounter more extreme versions of those situations. So yeah, I'm with you. Let's make a multi-scale multiplayer game, in which ethics is not in a container. It's kind of a consideration along with all the other really important considerations that people have to deal with out in the field.
Excellent. Does anyone want to respond to Beth, or Helen, would you like to go if not?
Sure. I'm just having a brief moment with my speakers, so I'm just getting them sorted out. But in the meantime, I can chat about, I suppose, what I would imagine my research project being, which would be less focused on the tool specifically. I'm not sure if I need to develop a new game. I'm quite interested in the framework around the game and I suppose how it gets implemented. So I think Matrix games, for example, work really well because they're already flexible and already easy enough for people to be able to pick up. So what I'm quite interested in, I suppose, is training better game facilitators and better game players. My background is from the humanities, so as Malcolm was saying, I really like the discussion that comes around the games. And I feel like that's useful to be able to kind of have the game as an example of a story that you can then sort of zoom out of and think about and talk about. So one of the things that my research questions are interested in are not just the games, but some of the framing and some of the setup around. So particularly drawing on creative writing expertise. So that might have to do with things like the techniques that we use to help develop empathy with particular characters. So creative writers have all sorts of techniques that we use in order to quickly generate a character in our minds and to be able to inhabit the perspective of that character. And I think that that can be really useful both as a training mechanism for defense forces, but also for scientists and researchers as well, so that they can move their own perspective and take a look at other other aspects of a particular problem. So character exercises as a way of framing games would be something that I'm quite interested in. But also, I suppose, what in science fiction and fantasy we call world building. So the set of techniques around how do we actually imagine what the future is going to look like? How do we tweak parts of the future, but with a systems thinking perspective, see how they might have an impact on other aspects of the system elsewhere. So if defense gave me a lot of money, I suppose what I would do is I would look at ways of being able to train people within defense to be able to run workshops that would allow them to be able to create quickly quite tailored games to address particular problems. That's the direction that I would go with it.
Thanks, Helen. Deane, would you like to suggest your incredible research project / new game / new training?
Yeah, sure. I think I would be hopefully joining in with this team, because I really like the direction it's going. And I completely agree with Malcolm that one of the things we really need to do, and to be fair, this is happening in defense, but is integrating the ethics component in with the other kinds of decision making that we're training people to do. That is definitely happening. We're seeing a lot more ethics aspects being added into training scenarios. But in a gaming context, we could definitely do a lot more, whether that's virtual or beyond. And I think for me, one of the aspects of that I think would need to be researched, which is what I would kind of bolt onto this, is our trying to figure out a way to accurately as we can replicate the red team's normative stance on things. So there's always this problem with wargaming that we tend to play against ourselves, right? We get someone who's the opposition, but they're people like us, and they think a bit like us, and they try to be, to think out of the box, and we're the bad guys, so we'll do some bad things. But there's a limit to how well we can do that. And I would be really interested in pursuing research that would find a way to try to identify the actual potential adversaries we might be facing, what sorts of ethical and other decision making they would be likely to make under certain situations. Can we build some kind of matrix that would enable us to actually be more accurate in that regard? So I think that would be part of it for me. The other is looking really at the other end of all this, and is thinking about exploring games as a way to address moral injury. So moral injury is a increasingly recognized malady, I suppose. It's certainly nothing like as well understood as PTSD, for example. But the idea is, roughly speaking, that we are, all of us, at some fundamental level, moral beings. That we, who we are, how we engage with the world is defined by our sense of what is right and wrong, better and worse, higher and lower, and so on. And we sometimes find ourselves in situations where we do something, or someone else does something, or we just see something that so shakes that moral sense of ourselves that we become no longer entirely functional as we were before. We become morally broken in some sense, and that's what's being referred to as moral injury. And we really haven't thought much about how we treat moral injury. Obviously, the best answer is to prevent it, and that's where training that will enable you to make better moral decisions can help with that. But perhaps the right kind of game would be a way to process those issues in a safe environment and an artificial environment, but it enables you to go through those issues that are underpinning that moral injury. So I don't know if that would work. Again, that's what the research would be to explore, but I think that's one area I would definitely want to go.
Thanks, Deane. Looks like we've got a proposal coming, Defence. Look out. Look, we've got a wonderful amount of ideas around the panel, but I'm sensitive to, we've got about 9 minutes left to try and explore topics. So I thought maybe we'll turn laterally for a minute and think about some other ways that games could be used to help defence think about a future conflict or a future war. So I'm going to throw two concepts out, but feel free to think of others. Two aspects of the current state of the world and the likely future state is that you're going to have increasingly high tempo conflicts. I think Beth already mentioned that. And you're going to have increasing disinformation and misinformation, attempts to deceive and confuse that all nations and non-state actors will use to try and manipulate the power dynamic. So that's our current sort of global order. And I think, as Helen pointed out, that grey zones are increasingly where conflict occurs, where there's no discrete battlefield per se. Instead, you have these mixed areas with commerce and non-state actors and, you know, gangs and the underworld and regular economics and other civilian activities. So if we take those three topics, the fast tempo, the disinformation and grey zone, is there something in the gaming world that would assist? I know, Helen, you've spoken about this a little bit, so maybe throw this out to others to think about. Is there something specific about the game, you know, context itself that actually helps us manage these challenges? And if so, what do you think we might be able to help our society to bring games in? Help! Help us! What do we do with this? What do we do with fast tempo? You know, what do we do with that? Like, how do we make a game that represents things at speed?
That's a big design problem to throw off the. I mean, for me, I see there's a lot of you know, there's a lot of real unknowns there. I think it comes back to the kinds of gaming that Helen was talking about, the more speculative world building gaming, where we've really got to imagine what these scenarios might be and try to you know. Yeah, I would be less thinking in that context. I would be less thinking about doing a game where you're playing that experience and more doing something like a world building game where you're imagining. The game facilitated your imagining of that scenario and working out answers. I mean, without a lot of time doing design work, I'm not sure how I would address that problem.
For me, narrative is the way into those things. I'm not a game expert, but so if you're talking about grey zone, where you've got multiple sort of contexts or discourses going at the same time, you've got two countries that say they really like working together, and at the same time they're kind of, you know, bothering each other's banking system on their computers. So there's sort of multiple levels that when you think about narrative principles and sort of structures of the way stories work, those kind of structures can be entertained and understood in that context. So at the moment we have human diplomats that manage that complexity, but wouldn't it be nice if a computer system could manage that complexity too and consider, you know, sort of a breadth and depth of information that a regular person can't. So, you know, and so grey zone is where I think narrative is particularly strong, and if it could be converted into a game, then or a formal system of some kind, then that would be really helpful.
Yeah. So maybe then there's a question of, you know, if we think about non-game solutions. So if we think about the way that things are done around here right now, as you point out, Beth, you've got these diplomats and diplomatic mechanisms. There's defense meetings and alliances. There's governance and trade. You know, there are the current ways that training occurs for each kind of person in their field that isn't a game. You know, they get taught what are the rules, you know, what are the rules and how do I operate and what's my obligations and my duties and my legal requirements. That's the way training occurs. And then in different spheres, people do different tasks to demonstrate competence. So what might be, you know, the advantage of the existing ways of doing things versus the disadvantage, and sort of flip that for games as well? What's maybe a disadvantage of using games? What's a risk of trying to turn these complicated situations into a game, for example?
Sometimes the simplification of the dynamics means that you might think you're playing a blue team versus a red team, but you're just playing probabilities against each other, or you're just playing sort of tokens against each other. It might not actually have anything intrinsically to do with how the situation would actually play out in that geography and that economy or whatever. But if you have a sophisticated storyteller like Helen, then you can build in those sorts of dynamics and gotchas.
Yeah, the power of games for learning often comes in. Games are very good at representing systems and letting you play with the system and gain a more intimate understanding of it through interaction rather than just through observation or being told about it. And often you can see the bigger dynamics of a system emerging from the low-level rules of the system, and so you get a deeper understanding of what's going on. That's both the strength and the weakness of the game. If you've got an accurate kind of model that produces these kind of dynamics, it gives you a much better understanding about why is this happening? What are the forces at play here, and how has this situation come about? The problem is, I guess, if your model is wrong, you can really learn a wrong model powerfully, and you can learn solutions which are purely artifacts of the model rather than real solutions. And that's where I guess you need the human element that Beth suggested, of saying, well, actually, yes, that works in the model, but that wouldn't work in real life because of whatever.
Yeah, it makes me think about games lawyering or rules lawyering, where people become experts at playing the game, and then the discussion becomes about how well do the mechanics represent the real world, or how do I manipulate the mechanics in order to get an advantage that may not actually be an active advantage in the real world. So I was a medieval reenactor for a long time, and we used to do sword fighting demonstrations and things like that. And people started getting very good at doing the form of sword fighting that we're doing as a sport, but the kinds of moves that you could make because of the particular tools that we were using, which were approximate, were still very specific to that environment and wouldn't necessarily translate over. So I suppose you can develop a kind of hyper specialization in a game world that doesn't carry over.
Right. All right, guys. Well, this is the end of the panel, unfortunately. I feel like we've only just begun, but I would like to offer everyone sort of 30 seconds to just make a final comment to sort of give our PAX attendees something to think about as they go about their day. So maybe Dean, do you want to start?
Sure. So I guess, our context is thinking about games in the context of the military, and it's worth just keeping in mind that a lot of what the military does is kind of games, right? That when they're not actually out doing military things, not fighting wars or assisting with disasters, they're practicing, and that practice is often in the form of something like a game. And so it's a very, very relevant and rich field for thinking this topic through.
Thanks, Dean. Maybe Beth, would you like to go next?
It's the place where the rules break down that gives you a lot of information. So I like Malcolm's observation that, you can extrapolate from like maybe a very simple rule set what the consequences are. And that's a wonderful aspect of the science of prediction. At the same time, I would always couple that with where are the limits of this world? What do I not include in this world? So that you're not caught by surprise.
Thanks, Beth. Malcolm, second last.
So the thing that my research always comes back to for me is when I'm playing a game, many games I will be doing things that would be reprehensible in the real world, and they're all right in the game. And I'm interested in thinking through, why do I feel all right doing this in a game? And not that I'm saying that it's wrong to do anything in a game, but why is this game, some games make me feel that it's all right to do things, and some games make me feel it's not all right to do things, and why am I feeling those different things at different times? So I would invite you all to start having that person in the back of your head now who says, why do I feel all right doing this in this game? That's my contribution.
Thanks, Malcolm. And Helen, why don't you tie us up with a bow?
Sure. I suppose we've talked a lot about games, but actually we haven't talked very much about play. So I think it's useful to actually bring us back into thinking about play. It's really difficult to write down a list of things you've never imagined before. So one of the things that game playing can do is it can get us to spaces of things that we hadn't considered in advance. And I think that that's one of the values of it.
Thanks all. Have a great day, and we'll see you next year at PAX.